Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Harry Lawson Aziris, and this is my YouTube channel, grecochess. While the grecochess online tournament chess.com is still going on, and we don't have any games being completed other than one timeout, I have requested from my Facebook friends to share with us some games that they would like to be displayed on our channel. A few of them have already been responding, and today we're going to show the first of these games, meaning the first one that replied to me. It comes from my Facebook friend Daniel Gormally from England. But before we go to this game, let's see how the tournaments are going. Let me share my screen with you. The tournament organized by my subscriber Zanilor. We need 243 people to start. We have 79 registered until now, including myself, and I would encourage my viewers, if you have an account just.com and would like to participate in a tournament, that is a wonderful one. But let's see how my own is going now. The Greco chess. As you see now, we have 38 games completed from the 48 of the first round. 10 remain for the round to be completed. There are 16 players, 4 groups of 4, and from every group, the top one advances to the next round. I had one win against Abdutalebe from Iran, but this was because of timeout, because my opponent could not complete a move in 3 days. Let's see how things are going in all the 4 groups. Group 1, Maxim Govorucha, 4 wins in 4 games, and let's see if Hunting Achievements is going to play and challenge. The other 2 players have been eliminated. Hunting Achievements has not played a single move, he's still using vacation time. 5 weeks remaining. And let's see what is going to happen. Group 2, it has been between Barak 7 from Israel and MGC 79 from Brazil. They both have 4 wins in 4 games. Everything will be decided in the games they play with each other. Group 3, where I participate, the Harry from Greece and the Lion from Hungary. Once again, what is going to happen in the 2 games between us. And Group 4, my skin from Italy has already advanced. But enough about these games, and let's go now to the game of my Facebook friend Daniel Gormally. This is how it's done. You see the chessboard. I'm going to enter the moves by one. By the way, the game has been saved in the chessbase.com webpage, and there we can also see Daniel's thoughts. And when Daniel shares his thoughts with us, I'm going to stop advancing the moves and tell you what Daniel has been thinking at that part of the game. Daniel has the white pieces with Daniel Gormally, and his opponent is Alexei Dreev from Russia with the black pieces. Daniel, as I mentioned before, he's from England. Their ratings. When the game took place, Daniel Gormally had a rating of 2472 and Alexei Drev 2704, meaning Alexei Drev was the big favorite, 232 points ahead. The game took place in Gibraltar in the year 2005. Gibraltar, I believe most of you know, it's a part of Great Britain located at the very southwest end of Europe, surrounded by Spain, that still has a claim on that. And from there, you can see the Straits of Gibraltar, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic Ocean. Currently, 20 years later, the ratings have fallen a little bit, but not by too much. Daniel Gormally has 2396 and Alexei Drev has 2584. We're going to show the moves and I'm going to enter them on the screen, and the computer is going to say who is better. A positive number means white is better, a negative number means that black is better, and computer will show if that move was the best or not. If not, which would have been the best move. Also, if the move happens to be an excellent, a good one, in accuracy, error or blunder. And let's start with the first move of the game. Daniel Gormally with the white pieces starts sending his pawn to d4. And Alexei Dreev starts the symmetric way, pawn to d5. Pawn to c4 for Daniel. This is the queen's gambit. Black is the option to win a pawn on c4. Most people will not prefer, because by doing so you will soon lose the pawn and also you surrender the center, but also the accepted is playable for people that have studied for quite well. But Alexei prefers to send his pawn to c6. This is called the Slav defense. Most players would place their pawn on e6, but this has the problem of blocking the bishop on c8. Daniel sends his knight to f3 and Alexei his knight to f6. Daniel his knight to c3 and Alexei his pawn to e6. This is necessary to keep control of d5 square, but the problem is that the bishop on c8 is now blocked. That's why one had played the pawn to c6 to keep the bishop free, but now it's also blocked. Bishop to g5 for Daniel, and by doing so, he pings the knight on f6. For many beginners and even intermediate players, pins are scary because they may accidentally and carelessly move the pinned piece and lose the queen. For advanced players like Alexei Dreev, that is not going to happen, but this means that you cannot use your knight even if you would otherwise have a wonderful combination. So the knight is inactive and you cannot use it to do something that could be very beneficial otherwise. That is why Alexei wants to end the pin, poses a question, as they say, by pushing the pawn to h6. We completed the first 5 moves. All of them are book moves. White has a small advantage of 0.39 just because he started first, but White now needs to decide what to do. Send the bishop back to h4, keep the pin, exchange with the queen, meaning take the knight and then queen takes the bishop, or maybe send it back. And Daniel decides to keep the pin, bishop to h4. Alexei will win a pawn on c4 and is a pawn ahead. Daniel sends his pawn to e4 and takes control of the center. 2 pawns are the 2 central squares, d4 and e4. This is supposed to be ideal and would be even more ideal if white was not a pawn below. Alexei doesn't like his knight being pinned, and he ends it by sending his pawn to g5. White needs to think what to do. Definitely cannot lose the bishop for free if if white does nothing. For example, if white moves the queen or the bishop, or the bishop on f1, I mean. White can push the bishop on g3, which is the best move, or perhaps, yes, attack the knight on e5, or even use the knight on f3 to take the pawn on g5, loses the knight with a pawn from h6, and then bishop wins the pawn. White has sacrificed a piece for 2 pawns, then the pin is still going on. And it would be wonderful, of course, if white could play a second move in a row and attack the knight by sending the pawn from e4 to e5, then the knight is lost. And white is ahead by 2 pawns, but that will not happen because in the meantime, black will have sent his bishop on e7. Move 8. Daniel sends his bishop to g3, and Alexei wants to save his pawn on c4, which is under attack from the bishop on f1, and that is why Alexei will send his pawn to b5. And move number 9, Daniel sends his pawn on e2. At this point, we're going to have a small interruption to read Daniel's thoughts. We'll do this whenever Daniel has shared his thoughts with chessbase.com. We're going to read his thoughts. Daniel says the following. At the time, this was at the forefront of fashionable theory and is still hotly debated today. Nowadays, I lazily play pawn goes to e5, black sends knight to d5, and white knight sends knight to d2, which, to be honest, if black knows what he's doing, isn't very good. These are Daniel's thoughts, and we'll continue reading his thoughts as the game advances. Black is going to send his bishop to b7 and win control of the long diagonal h1 to a8. In many games, in the queen's gambit accepted, meaning if black takes a pawn on c4, if black is not careful, white can place a bishop on g2, and before black knows it, the rook on a8 is lost. I know it because myself, I have suffered from this thing until I learned my lesson. Don't accept the queen's gambit pawn. White say now that the G and H files are quite weakened, white will try to attack, send the pawn to h4. If black does nothing, pawn takes on g5, and then black cannot take back the pawn because they lose the rook on h8. If you take back the pawn, then white will take the bishop on h4, and there is once again the pin on the knight. Instead, black is going to send the pawn on g4 and attack the knight on f3. We completed the first 10 moves. All of them are book moves, as you see here, these little books that you see here. White gets a small advantage of 0.21 just because they started first. Move 11, knight. Of course, white will save the knight. Goes to e5, and the pawn on g4 is attacked 3 times by knight on e5, by bishop on e2, and by queen on d1. Of course, not directly because there's a bishop in front of it, but what I mean is that if an exchange started, at the last part of the exchange, the queen could take the pawn if necessary. Black has only one move to save the pawn. Pawn goes to h5. Even though white attacks it 3 times and black defends it twice, white cannot take it. Yes, because they'll end up having the extra pawn, but they will lose a piece for that. White decides to castle kingside. At least they have 2 of their pawns in front of the king, f2 and g2. But really, white needs to be careful. And of course, at the level of these 2 players, they know exactly what to do depending on what the opponent will play. And Alexei develops the knight going to d7. White says the queen on c2. And black does not like at all the knight on e5. Among other things, it controls the c6 square. At least it exerts pressure, so black cannot move the bishop from b7. Black is going to take the knight. And bishop is going to take the knight now on e5. White has played 14 moves, black has played 13. Until now, they are all book moves, believe it or not. It's very rare to see players knowing so well the theory that play book moves until here. Black needs to be careful because their knight on f6 is pinned, meaning if it moves, then the rook on h8 is lost. How does black reply? Computer says the best move is put the bishop on g7 and the second best is put bishop on h6, but black will send the bishop on h6. But after black played the move, computer says that was the best. How can the computer change their mind so fast? It is because after playing the move, the computer has a slightly deeper, slightly more depth, one more players. It's called a half a move. And since the difference was too small, maybe after the move was played, the computer thought that this really was the best. But now, once again, an interruption to read the thoughts of Daniel. Daniel says the following. Played quickly and confidently by Dreev. Clad in his dark leather jacket, he cast a powerful aura, and I now began to feel intimidated. The 2700 charisma was kicking in. He refers to Alexei Dreev's rating. My preparation had pretty much gone out the window after this move, which was an over-the-board novelty at the time. Black wants to play a later knight to d7 without allowing the inevitable exchange of bishops on d7. And he also wants to avoid a forced throw. And then Daniel says what would happen if bishop went to g7. Then most likely he would put the rook from a1 to d1, even though pawn to b3 is a main line. And continue saying how the game could proceed until move number 22. How, if things went the way he liked, he could gain a draw. says the 22nd move of black was the line I had been hoping for because I only needed a draw to secure my final Grandmaster norm and the title, but it was naive to believe he would blindly go down this line. The rating gap was too vast and he wanted to win. We completed the first 14 moves and now 15 move for white for Daniel. Pawn goes to b3. And these are his thoughts about that. b3. Nevertheless, I quickly recovered my equilibrium and found this move, which has become the main response. This was where my earlier preparation had been helpful. I had noticed that b3 was the typical break for white in such systems. One of the ideas is that by freeing up the d3 square, you beat the path for a later bishop to d3, knight to e2, which opens up attacking options on the king side. That's what Daniel thinks about his move. Pawn from c4 goes to b3, so black will take it. And we've completed 15 moves. White is ahead by 0.53, or a little bit more than half a pawn. White will send his pawn from a3 to b3, will get back the pawn. And black is going to castle kingside. This is a little scaring, I would say, at least for a player at my level, because the g and the h files are open, and black has no pawns on g7, h7. There is one on f7, but the field is quite open and it invites a white attack. The computer says the best because, of course, a player at Dreev's level, Alexei's level, knows how to react. He's not going to be caught by surprise. Bishop to d3 for white. Once again, let's see what Daniel is thinking about this move. Continue with my plan to bring the knight to g3. But Daniel thinks that rook from f1 to d1 is now more typically played and most of the games tend to end in draws. But as I said, I was on my own at the time. On his own, of course, 20 years ago in 2005 when the game took place, the computers were much less advanced than now. It was barely a few years after Deep Blue beat Kasparov and proved that computers can beat humans, even the strongest ones, but they were not so strong as they are now, where humans have absolutely no chance. Let's see how the game will continue. Rook to e8 for Alexei, and let's see Daniel's thoughts once again. A flexible move. Black wants to preempt any bishop to d6 tabs. Knight going to d7, bishop to d6, and then queen taking on h4. Somewhat chaotic play was another reasonable option. Black can often give up the exchange in these lines because the dark squared compensation that you will receive will be considerable. To use trend-like terminology, Garry Kasparov would be all over this. These are Daniel's thoughts not only about his move, but also about the Alexei's move, but also about the alternative knight going to d7. But now we continue. Knight goes to e2 for white. Knight to d7 for black. Inaccuracy is a computer. Would rather have the bishop take on f6. Bishop to g3 for white. Now the bishop is under attack. Of course, the pawn will take it back, but white doesn't want to have double pawns along the e-file, and not only the double the little bit away from the others. That's why bishop goes to g3. Inaccuracies in the computer. Would rather have the bishop go to d6. The problem on d6 is that the bishop is not protected. So if the knight moves again, then white would need to find a way to save the bishop. And now the evaluation is even according to the computer. Pawn to e5 for black. And white, Daniel sends his pawn to f3. Computer believes that this is a mistake. In fact, now black is ahead by 0.36. Well, it's a mistake because it will allow for the bishop to go to e3 check. Every time you move a pawn, you might make another square weak. The square e3 was before covered by the pawn on e2 from f2. Now this is not the case any longer, and that is why Alexei will check from e3. Let's see what Daniel has to think now. Well, let's see what he has to think after the response. White has how many moves? Two moves to block it, of course. To put the rook would be a little bit stupid because then you lose exchange. To put the bishop might be okay. Then you invite exchange. King can go to either h1 or h2. Computers you see here would prefer the king to go to h1, but Daniel placed it on h2. And now we're going to see what does Daniel think about his move. The computer says that this is a good move, but the but black now has an advantage of 0.25. Let's see what Daniel thinks about this move. He says, as soon as I played this, I had the horrible feeling that I had just blundered. So got up from the board to take a walk along the around the playing hall to compose myself. The room where the event took place was a glass bowl design, similar to many other hotels in this region, giving relaxing views of the sea. I believe he means the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean. It was hard to feel bad in such a situation, but I was still very afraid that I had blown this game and was now feeling a little bit like a bit of an idiot. I could just imagine losing, running out of the tournament hall in tears, having been crushed in under 2 hours, and all my friends and the spectators nodding to each other in knowing fashion while muttering, well, it was to be expected. And now, let's see how Alexei will continue the game. The pawn from e5 goes to d4, and Daniel shares the following thoughts. The reason I thought I had thrown the game away was because I thought he would play bishop to f4, and it was only when I calmed down that I saw that if he took back the bishop on f4, his bishop took the bishop, and then a series of moves, queen takes to h4 check, king to g1, and so on, was working out in white's favor. A lesson: don't panic the chess game, even if you think that you are lost. Try to compose yourself. Not always easy, easier said than done, as they say. And now we continue, move 22. Daniel will take the g4 pawn. No, move 22 is yes. Daniel will take the g4 pawn with his pawn on f3. Computer says it's the best. Let's see what Daniel is thinking. I fed this position and into the default freeze on chess page, parenthesis not during the game, I might add, close parenthesis, and at first it likes black, but I dig deeper and it's clear that white is the one with the practical chances. His king is much safer here than its counterpart, which is exposed down the opener file and almost completely bereft of pawn cover. Just much easier for white to play. All my pieces are flooding to attacking squares, and the rook can go to f5, the knight to f4, etc. I think this is one of those cases where you shouldn't completely trust the computer evaluation. These are Daniel's thoughts. Of course, the computer script at the time was the freeze that was way below today's uh, stock fish and the other advanced computers. Knight goes to e5 for black. Attacks the bishop at d3. Computer thinks it's the best. Let's see what Daniel thinks, or at least thought at the time. He puts question mark and exclamation, meaning dubious moves. Now, after this inaccurate move, the game begins to turn in my favor. That's what Daniel thinks, even though the computer doesn't agree. Today's computer. Um, Daniel also says it was better to play h5 pawn and takes on g4, even if the game remains very messy after rook takes on f5. And then he says, although the engine evaluation still favors black, I would hate to be defending here. It is just so easy for white to play. What does it mean easy to play? A position may be even if both players play the best moves. But let's assume there's a case where under they are even, yes, but one player must play only moves, meaning the second best move is going to have them lose the game, while the other player has three or four equally good moves. Of course, it's better to play with the one that has the more options. We continue with the game with move number 23. Move number 23, and the white pawn goes to g5. White grabs more space. It's a great move to the computer, more space near black's king. Black decides to take the bishop at d3. The best move to the computer. Let's see what Daniel thinks. In fact, let's even see. We skipped the part. What did the computer think after the pawn goes to g5? After the pawn went to g5, Daniel thought, now white will always have excellent chances. I have an obvious plan of attacking on the king's side and also gain control over the important square on f6. Now, back to the chessboard with the knight taking on d3, and now we have the latest thoughts from Daniel. Daniel would prefer for black, would think it would be better for black if instead he sent his knight to the g4 square with a check, king to h1 and rook to e6. Also leads to a position that is difficult to assess. This might have been preferable to the game because with the knight lurking on g4, white might be reminded that the king's side is not a completely one-sided battle. Then again, my plan remains very obvious. Double rooks on the f file, and then something is bound to turn up. Maybe e5, pawn to e5 works at some point, or knight to f4. It just looks like so much fun for white to play. That is after 23 moves. Move number 24, of course, the white queen will take the knight on d3. This is an only move, otherwise you lose a piece. Pawn to c5 for black. And this opens the diagonal for the bishop on b7. Until now, it was immediately blocked by the pawn on c6. Knight can even attack the pawn on e4, attack twice, defended once. White knight goes to f4. And black, Alexei Dreev, takes a pawn on e4. Black is ahead by 2 pawns. The computer says this is a great move and black has an advantage of 0.37. But white recovers one of the pawns, takes the pawn on b5. Bishop takes the knight on f4, rook takes on f4 now. And the black queen goes to d5. You see here the pawn g2 is in danger. Not only that, then this is a pawn next to the king and the white king might be in danger. Let's see what Daniel has to say at this point. He smashed this out quickly, but I sensed this confidence was a bit of a bluff. Can't I just take the pawn on a7 now? He was also getting terribly short of time, and now I was reminded of the game that I had against Sutovsky. Okay, here the position isn't exactly clear, but with his clock situation being so bad, it was very important that I kept control of my nervous state and worked my way through the variations systematically. So I sat on my hands. And the next move of Daniel was rook takes on a7. And in case you wonder, can't black take the rook on a7? Yes, but then they lose the rook on e8. Bishop to f5 for black. Pawn to b4 for white. Black cannot take it, otherwise they lose the queen. And the rook from a8 goes to c8 for black. That's where Alexei sends his rook. Computer says this is a mistake and white finally has an important advantage, 1.19. Well, that does not yet decide the game, but it's significant to say the least. And move number 30, queen goes to f1 for white. Great move, says the computer. And let's see what Daniel has to say about his move. I was proud of this counterintuitive retreat. Uh, let's speak about the retreats. Now, this is my comment, is that most of the times to retreat a piece is not a good move, especially for beginners that cannot see that deeper. Avoid retreating pieces unless. And to find a retreating move only, and also a move that helps you, a retreating move that helps you more than a regular move, this only the greatest of the players can do. That is why Daniel was right to feel proud of that. And Daniel continues. It places back in an almost impossible situation with his flag hanging. Well, at that time, they used analog clocks with flags, and when the flag would fall down, then the time was over. So his flag was hanging, meaning it was near to go down. Finding enough accurate moves to reach the time control with his king under fire. Daniel replies with his bishop going to g6. Otherwise, as you see, the pawn on f7 was attacked 3 times and defended only by the two rooks and the queen, defended only twice by the queen and the king. Now it's defended 3 times. Rook to f6 for white. And let's see what Daniel is thinking about it. This was the idea that I had seen earlier when I played queen goes to f1. White threatens to take on g6 and then play queen to f6. Rook to c6 for Alexei wants to exchange the rooks. Well, when one side is attacking, the other defending, the attacker wants to keep, most of the times, wants to keep pieces and the defense wants to exchange them. Because if everything is exchanged, as you see, that not only is the material equal, but black has a very strong pawn of d4. If everything disappeared and only kings and pawns remained, black would be winning. The pawn on d4 would promote to d1. Even if white was to play, I think first the pawn would make it to d1 and then the pawn to b8. But white, of course, is not going to exchange. White will send Daniel sends his queen on b5. Well, if black wants, he can still take the rook on f6, but look what's happened. The queen will take the rook on e8 with a check, and after the king goes anywhere is either g7 or h7, then the pawn on g5 will take the rook, and white is a rook ahead. Rook from e8 goes to c8 for black. Now, computer says that this is a blunder. From now, from one point something or near one, white has an advantage of 5.00. You see here, this is really very crucial, especially at that level. White is very near victory, but let's see if white will actually win or will stay very near victory. White will send the queen to b7, which the computer thinks is the best. But we're going to go back a couple of moves because we skipped the thoughts of Daniel. Queen to b5, and let's see what Daniel said at this point. He said, back we go. Black is reduced to almost complete immobility. Continue now. Rook from e8 to c8, the blunder, and queen goes to b7 for white. Computer says that this is the best possible move, and white's advantage becomes 5.66, a great move. And now we're going to read once again the thoughts of Daniel. Rook takes on g6 is again a threat. See what's going to happen if white could play again and take the bishop on g6 with a check. Then if pawn takes, queen to g7 is mate. If rook takes, then queen takes on c8 the other rook. But let's see how black is going to react. Black will send the queen to e4 to defend the bishop. Computer says it is good, although they prefer the bishop go to e4, but now white's advantage, as you see, is 9.94. And now white will take the pawn on f7. Computer says it is brilliant. Why do they put it brilliant? Because it's a good move, but you sacrifice material. Satisfy your rook. But if the bishop takes it, queen goes to f7, king to h8, and queen to g7 mate. But let's see the thoughts of Daniel. I think his flag fell or he resigned. I can't remember which. I just recall feeling this ecstatic sense of relief and joy that everything I'd been struggling towards for so many years had finally been accomplished. Uh, as you may remember from his previous thoughts, he needed at least a draw to become Grandmaster, and with a win, of course, he became. That's what he means. I could hardly sign the score sheets. My hands were shaking so much. Simon Williams came over to congratulate me. Simon Williams, by the way, is another British chess player, one of the Grandmaster, and also he had, I'm not sure if he still has, he's got his own YouTube stream channel. Came to congratulate me and was as gracious as ever. I then wandered out to the harbor for a short walk. Of course, the tournament was not over, so although I contemplated getting drugged at night, I realized I couldn't get completely hammered. As I sat and gazed across the bay, I felt this deep sense of achievement that is difficult to put into words. I wish I had repeated this moment in later years, but I'm still waiting for my next victory against a 2700 player. Perhaps the fact that I haven't been back to Gibraltar since has something to do with it. When asked about this game in a later conversation with Simon Williams, Ivan Sokolov apparently said in that typically biting way of his, Gormally played very well for such a weak player. So, game is over. And Daniel Gormally had a great win, and he has every reason to be proud of that. And I'm glad, thank you, Daniel, for sharing this game and these moments and these thoughts with us, with me, with the viewers. It was very nice of you. In fact, he replied to my Facebook message minutes after I had made the request. He was the first one to reply. But let's see now. Let's do the review. Let's see what the computer has to say about the game. By the way, the computer has no idea who was playing these moves. I just enter them manually. And let's see. Daniel Gormally had accuracy of 95.9% versus 86.9% for Alexei Dreev. And Daniel played as if his rating was 2500, a little bit higher than his 2472 of that time, and even higher than his 2396 now. While Alexei Dreev played as if his rating was 2300, much, much, much higher than mine, but a little bit lower than his own. Let's go to the various categories. Daniel had one brilliant move, two great moves for each of them. Best 11 for Daniel, 8 for Alexei. Excellent 1 for Daniel, 3 for Alexei. Good 3 for Daniel, 2 for Alexei. And look at that. Book moves 14 for Daniel, 13 for Alexei. Since meaning 27 totally. Since the game lasted totally 67, meaning 34 plus 33. 27 out of 67 is about 40%. Inaccuracies, 1 for Alexei. Mistakes, 1 for Daniel, 4 for Alexei, and misses, 1 for Daniel. This concludes the video. We have more games to show. More of my Facebook friends have replied. And of course, if any of the Greco chess games ends, we're going to let you know. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you like the channel, you may, and if you have not subscribed, you may consider doing so. All you need to do is just click the subscribe button. Thanks to the viewers, the subscribers, to the likes, and to the nice comments. I'm Harilos Aniziris. This is my Greco Chess YouTube channel. Ladies and gentlemen, goodbye.